Yeah, wherever you prefer.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Happy Monday. Well, I am going to introduce tonight's presenter. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. This is Cyane Crump. She has served as the Executive Director of Historic Richmond since 2015, where she works to shape the future of Richmond by preserving its distinctive historic character, sparking revitalization, and championing its past and future architectural legacy. She's a Richmond native, and she took a 7-year detour to Charlottesville, where she developed an appreciation for contributions of Virginia and Virginians to American history and architecture. She, after graduating from the University of Virginia and the University of Virginia School of Law, she practiced law at Hunton and Williams, now Hunton Andrews Kurth, for the better part of 2 decades, first as an associate and then as a partner in the corporate section. Her practice focused on mergers, acquisitions, corporate transactions, private equity, and fund formation, real estate investment trust, securities, and general business law matters. That's a lot to keep straight. Her career includes extensive experience in nonprofit governance service with community boards and participation in Leadership Metro Richmond's class of 2005. Her service has been recognized with awards such as Style Weekly's Top 40 Under 40. Everybody, Cyane Crump.
Good evening, everyone. Oops, can you guys hear me? Is this, all right. Just want to make sure, and make sure everybody in the rooms can hear me as well. I'm so excited to be here tonight with all of you all on this frigid, cold night. It sounded like everybody had a great dinner. It was very loud and rowdy in there, so I don't know whether any more folks will wander in here, but I am excited to talk to you tonight about people, places, and preservation. I'm a little bit scared to be talking to you about this because you have probably learned more Virginia history than, and have forgotten more Virginia history than I know today. So please don't be shy about correcting me or asking questions afterwards. But I thought I would share with you a little bit tonight about my perspective on Richmond, its history, and its historic places using several case studies. So this is going to be a little bit history, a little bit philosophy, and a little bit about current events and projects we have going on in the city today. So first, you probably need to know that Historic Richmond is a nonprofit with a mission to preserve, protect, and promote Richmond's historic buildings, neighborhoods, and places. We are celebrating our 90th anniversary this year. During that time, we have saved hundreds of structures, both large and small, all over Richmond, but mostly in its oldest neighborhoods and places. Our work goes back, as I said, almost a century, and these case studies go back almost that far. These are the places that are threatened over and over again and that require constant attention. They illustrate the successes and failures of preservation and our work. And from them, we can learn what worked, what didn't, and what we can do better as a community in the future. So why did I choose these particular places? Through them, we can focus on how the Richmond we know today was built and developed and redeveloped over the centuries. And we see why community organizations like Historic Richmond are vital to saving what is unique, beautiful, and authentic about Richmond. So as I mentioned, we've been around 90 years, working to preserve important elements of Richmond's historic built environment. Our history actually began in Shockoe, which some people call Shockoe Bottom or the Shockoe Valley. When we were founded to save the Adam Craig House, which is the building you see right there. Shockoe is the valley where Richmond began. Its history is truly that of a melting pot, and its historic built environment reflects the history and culture of Richmond, from the enslaved to early immigrants to the founding fathers to literary icons like Edgar Allan Poe. And Shockoe has the largest concentration of the oldest historic resources in the city. The Mayo plan, which might be hard for you to see, but that is the plan at the showing the gridded pattern of the streets in the background of this slide. The old stone house, which is known today as the Poe Museum, the Adam Craig House, as I mentioned earlier. This is Mason's Hall. That's the Shockoe African burial ground, and that's the old Hebrew cemetery. It's actually in here and surrounded by a modern apartment building. More recently, Shockoe's history and all of its complexity has led to a lot of conflict among different stakeholders. And we've worked very closely with a bunch of different planning initiatives in the city and multiple stakeholders to find a way to accommodate that new growth through density without demolition and to protect the surviving historic resources and support the development of historic and heritage projects in Shockoe. And here is a picture of a walking tour that we sponsored in Shockoe, focused on a lot of these different initiatives. This is in front of the 1818 Crump Double House, which one of my ancestors actually built as a rental property and is just barely still standing. So let's go to our first case study, which is in Shockoe Bottom. This first case study is about Mason's Hall, and it shows how preservationists can successfully work with private property owners to help them steward their historic property. This is Mason's Hall. It has been owned by the Richmond Randolph Lodge number 19 since 1787. That's so long that you can't even find a deed in the property records. In 2014, the Masons pulled together enough money to replace a leaky roof. And after replacing that leaky roof, the building began to dry out and an issue with the roof beam appeared. What actually happened was the beam right above this brace cracked in half and started to collapse. And so the ceiling fell 7 inches. And this happened while people were in the building. So this temporary brace was installed to stabilize the building. But as I mentioned, it was temporary, and a permanent fix was needed. So why is Mason's Hall so important to save, or why did we think it was so important to save? It's one of the oldest surviving structures in the city. It was the first purpose-built Masonic building in the entire country, and it is the longest continuously occupied Masonic building in the entire country. In its early days, city council and city courts met here. Religious denominations that did not have their own meeting halls or places of worship met here, and it has a long list of people and events with which it is associated. In many ways, its history is very closely intertwined with that of our city. And its history is yet to be studied in depth, in the depth that it merits. And that history would be a lot harder to understand, more challenging to understand if the building were to be lost. So we learned of the roof issue in 2015 and explored how we could help. Yes, there were a lot of meetings over several years and years of meetings. And yes, it involved suits, shuffling paper. Remember, I was a corporate lawyer, so that is me with my suit shuffling some paper. But in addition to shuffling paper, it involved putting in place longer-term preservation protections, such as an easement, a protective easement, and city old and historic district status. That's the city's preservation zoning overlay. as well as our support, Historic Richmond support, to hire a structural engineer. And this picture is actually in the basement, which was the first part of Mason's Hall to be constructed. So we needed a structural engineer to investigate this roof beam issue and develop a solution for how to make a repair. We conducted an RFP process to identify an appropriate structural engineer, and the Masons selected Randy Tritt of Balzer, and he's been very helpful to us with lots and lots of projects. And here you can see the roof structure as a 3D red. This is the 3D laser scan of the roof structure, which a company called Prologue Systems did. If you see this little ladder up here, that goes up to about 15 to 20 feet up to the attic, and that's the only way into the attic. And then they were able to 3D laser scan it, and it might be hard for you to see, but there's a little sort of, that's not exactly a straight line there. That was the roof beam at issue. All right, who can imagine a meeting like this today in person and not virtual? At least most of our meetings people want to do virtually, so it was nice to be in person. This was 2017, so it took 2 years to get to this point. Here, the Masons and Historic Richmond's preservationists and several volunteers who were expert in this type of issue meet to discuss the alternative approaches to repair. At this point, we did not know how to pay for the repairs, but we knew that it was really important. So we also knew we wanted to go with the approach that was the most preservation sensitive. So as we worked to develop this, the best approach, we were very fortunate to have angels appear, and those angels appeared in the form of the Svoboda family. Mrs. Svoboda's late uncle, Matthew Mezzanotte, was a passionate Mason, and with their support and with now understanding the best approach, we were able to move forward with the repairs. Now, I just want to point out this little round attic vent up at the roof line in the attic. Just remember that. We'll come back to it. So here you can see the problematic beam. That's the crack. That's supposed to all be one piece right there. The repair, this is both before and after the repair. So before and after down here. The repair involved encasing that beam in steel, and each of these steel beams had to be hoisted up into the attic through that little round attic vent. That was remember, the two ways up to the attic were the round attic vent and that ladder. So this was the way to get them in. And each floor then needed to be jacked up to re-level the beam once the steel was in place. And so here's some of that bracing system that was used to jack up the basement first floor, then the second floor, then the third floor. As that work was in process, a similar issue was found with another beam. So here are both beams after the repairs were completed in the fall of 2018, all nice and solid and secure. So now that we have gotten through this, what's called stabilization and keeping the building standing up, we decided we needed to move on to what in the preservation world we call sealing the building envelope. So that's to keep water out of the building. And one of the key elements of sealing the building envelope is often painting the building. And this building had not been painted in more than 40 years. We generally recommend painting every 5 to 10. So we brought in paint conservator Dr. Susan Buck and window specialist Dixon Kerr, and here you can see them discussing where best to take paint samples so that we can identify what the right colors were to paint the building. And it turns out that little round attic vent, because it was so hard to reach, was one of the best places to find good paint samples. So here are Dr. Buck's paint. This is her paint analysis. And what she does, she subjects it to some chemical analysis, and then she takes a slice. And so this is layers of paint going back in time to the very earliest at the bottom. So that underside of that round attic vent, because it had been painted so infrequently, actually had the oldest paint. That's this right here. It had 17 layers of paint going back to the late 1700s. So this was the oldest sample of paint found on the building. And the bottom right sample is from a shutter, a window shutter. And you can see how vivid some of these greens are in here. They're really very bright, and brighter than you might expect. The most complete paint color information we had for all the different parts of the building came from 1872, when the front porch was added on the Masons Hall. So our team decision was to go with the 1872 paint palette. And this is that 1872 paint palette, except this right here, that's an 1825. We just thought it would be interesting to see how much brighter an 1825 green was than the 1872 green. So we had paint elements for the porch, the window sashes, the shutters, but what about the siding? Dr. Buck's paint analysis for the siding only showed paints from the 20th century, which probably meant that all the siding was replaced in the 20th century, which is not surprising because there was a fire on one side of the building, or the buildings on either side of Masons Hall burned. So with no documentary evidence of that 1872 siding color, we consulted various experts in the decorative arts, and like people do with their houses, we splashed a couple of samples up on the wall. We also used the Commission of Architectural Review's paint palette, and we ended up selecting this Roycroft vellum as the most appropriate. And so here is the final product of those projects. This took the better part of 7 years. So these things don't happen overnight. Part of that is pulling together the funding. Part of it is pulling together the team. But we stretched our limited funds to ensure that the building is better able to survive for future generations. So remember, this is one of the oldest buildings in the city. Our involvement also helped to launch the Masons on their own efforts with additional projects like the rehabilitation of the front steps and the faux graining of the doors. And this work also really spiffs up what had been sort of derelict, shabby-looking block of Shockoe quite nicely. So what are the lessons from this case study? The lessons are that preservation takes patience, perseverance, and lots of people. This was a really complicated project, but I think it was a great partnership between us and the Masons. It took a lot of effort, but we are very grateful to all the different players who helped make this happen. So now we move to downtown Richmond and Capitol Square in particular. As the center of so much history and holding so many public buildings, it has been a big focus of our preservation efforts. And with the Capitol building, which you can see here right in the middle of the landscape, Thomas Jefferson introduced classical design principles and monumental architecture to the United States, and it would become the standard for American governmental buildings for decades to come. And as a whole, Capitol Square is a national historic landmark. This is because of the collective importance of the historic fence, which you can't really see in this picture, but it's a very important historic fence, one of the oldest in the country. The collection of the fence, the historic buildings, the landscape plan, and the statuary. And most of the buildings around the square are historic, and there are several national historic landmarks around the square as well. And so just to orient you, this is West Hospital, this is Old City Hall, this is the General Assembly Building, this is the former Hotel Richmond, which is now the Attorney General's office. That spire is St. Paul's. This is the Pocahontas Building West Tower. This building covered in scaffolding is the former Customs House, Federal Courthouse. And we'll move around and talk about several of those. So here's one of those National Historic Landmarks, Old City Hall. While this building was built on Capitol Square, the center of Virginia government, it was built by the city of Richmond. It was designed by Elijah Myers, who designed 5 state capitals around the country. And his design here is an expression of the vitality of a thriving Richmond, unique in style and unique in the city. And it has one of the finest cast iron interiors in the country. You know, for a city known for its ironwork, that's really important. And it was built entirely with local materials, Virginia granite in particular, and entirely with local labor. And what's remarkable is that for the first time since the Civil War, both blacks and whites worked cooperatively to construct this building on a project of this size and scope. So some of you all may remember this. This was before my time, but the city started working on plans to demolish this building in the 1960s, and then they kicked into high gear in the 1970s. And at that point, a bunch of community members got involved. The saving of Old City Hall took the better part of a decade, a steady barrage of citizen appeals to city council members, passionate appeals at city council meetings, the lobbying of the Chamber of Commerce. And over 1,100 people permitted their names to appear in a full-page newspaper ad asking city council to save Old City Hall. This community support, and here's that newspaper ad, that's only part of the names. This community support cut across racial and class lines. And with that support, Historic Richmond was able to broker a deal with the city and the state and a private developer. What's interesting is that the state wanted this because they wanted the streets around Old City Hall. They weren't so interested in the building, and a private developer thought it would make good office space, and the city just wanted to get rid of it. So we were able to broker this deal. Over the course of a decade, there were many opportunities for this effort to fail. That it succeeded was a testament to the broad, deep, and diverse and passionate advocacy of this coalition and the national attention that it received and the uniquely compelling story of Old City Hall. So even though the technologies have changed, people don't really read newspapers anymore. This is still the model for large-scale preservation advocacy. And since that last major restoration was completed over 40 years ago, our long-term lease on the building has been converted into an easement. And the state understands that this is a really significant property, and they've just completed a Golden Hammer Award-winning project to rehabilitate Old City Hall. They completed this in 2023, and here you can see that cast iron interior. Some of you all may recall the old color scheme that was put in place in the 1980s, which was very vivid jewel-toned hues. Well, that was a beautiful color scheme, and that was appropriate for buildings of that type and cast iron interiors of that type, of that vintage. but it was not actually what was used in 1893 when the building was constructed. So this is based on precise paint analysis, and it's interesting that you have cast iron that's painted white, and then this also is cast iron, but it's painted to look like oak. So white and faux grained white oak. So we're super grateful to the state that they now recognize the significance of this building architecturally, culturally, and historically, and really pursued this project the right way. We thank them for their efforts. But we would really like to see visitors welcome to this building as they should be, because this is just a blockbuster, beautiful building. And it's one of the community's favorite buildings. The public should be able to enjoy this space, we think. And the other really interesting feature as part of this restoration was the addition of an ADA ramp on the west entrance. So that's why that picture is there. So moving on around Capitol Square, you can see Old City Hall is on the right here. This is what we called the GAB, or the General Assembly Building. This is photographed in 2016. And this, when the state began to discuss demolition of this GAB, we again kicked into gear, building a coalition to discuss our concerns with the state. We thought the entire complex had architectural value. This is the 1912 Life of Virginia building, and then this is a 1923 tower facing Broad Street. Both of these were designed by a New York firm known for steel skyscrapers called Clinton and Russell. And the key architect on this was Alfred Bossum, who was a British lord. And this was designed by Marcellus Wright and is actually a beautiful modernist building. So we thought all of this had value, but the building's regular users thought it was just terrible, beyond its useful life, just didn't work, and worse. We see this a lot. It's called bad building syndrome. Building owners starve a building of funding, fail to keep it in good repair, decide that it is the building's fault, not their own, and that the building needs to go. Most preservationists I mentioned cared the most about this 1912 classical facade. And so that was where we focused our efforts. And here's a detail of that facade. I'm not sure whether you all can see it in the back of the room, but these capitals across the facade, they're winged horses, the first example of Pegasus capitals, the only example of Pegasus capitals in Richmond, winged eagles and cherubs. So we thought this was truly unique in Richmond and beautifully executed, and making it the most likely element of the structure to be saved. And we lobbied the General Assembly and the governor. We sent letters, we raised awareness of the building, but we did it pretty subtly by writing architectural histories and referencing it in our lecture programs. Less subtly, we nominated it to Preservation Virginia's Most Endangered list. This got a lot of publicity, like front page publicity here and in the Washington Post. But rather than jumping in front of the media to pump up the volume, we stepped back a little bit. Politics are pretty complex, and we spent a lot of time strategizing about the right level of public pressure to apply. There was a limited pot of money for the General Assembly building, the restoration of Old City Hall, and a new parking deck. And we did not know whether the planned restoration of Old City Hall might suffer for our pushing this. But the public pressure that we applied was noticed, and this is the end result. In the end, that media attention coupled with a study that showed that 1912 facade could be saved in a cost-effective manner, and the desire of General Assembly leadership to house itself in a high-quality building respectful of Jefferson's capital ultimately were what saved this important facade. So the lesson from this is that sometimes it's being on the right frequency rather than maximizing the volume that saves a building. This was another 2023 Golden Hammer winner. And I like this, sorry. I like this because you can see how the landscaping, that's one of the streets that was part of the deal that the state really wanted to acquire. And what's really cool is there's a tunnel that goes under here to the Capitol. There's another tunnel that goes to that new parking deck over here. So during this construction, it was a really impressive construction project, working on Old City Hall, the General Assembly Building, the parking deck, and multiple tunnels. And they also had opened up the steps of the Capitol for more waterproofing. So there was a huge amount of work being done on Capitol Square. But while the Old City Hall and General Assembly buildings are model projects, the Commonwealth does not always follow this approach with other buildings. The decision to demolish this historic building was made in a backroom budget deal. This 1923 limestone skyscraper is very impressive architecturally, and we believe it can and should be saved. We've tried to fight this, but when these decisions are not made in daylight, by the time the public hears anything about it, it's really too late to impact the public decision, to impact the decision. And in fact, right now, there are several million square feet of state-owned office buildings that the state is considering demolishing in downtown Richmond. The most recent buildings demolished by the state have been replaced with low-rise parking decks, parking lots, and in some cases, vacant lots. And we believe this sucks the life out of downtown Richmond, and we hope that won't be the case in the future. So we end this Capitol Square case study with mixed results and the clear need for the community to let their elected representatives know that Capitol Square is an important civic, political, and cultural center and should be treated with the highest sensitivity and respect. And that state building projects should model high-quality, enduring, and sustainable architecture. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of other downtown buildings that are in the news right now and that we've been focused on. This is the Richmond Light Infantry Blues Armory. Many of you may remember this from its 1980s reincarnation as part of 6th Street Marketplace. It's solidly constructed of reinforced concrete. It was designed by its Washington architects and engineers to withstand rioters, but was also designed to accommodate market stalls and booths on the ground floor with secure entrances to the upper floors for militia units. And the 3rd floor drill hall actually did double duty as an arena or convention type space. It was partially rehabbed in the 1980s, but not that 3rd floor drill hall. But it is again vacant and in need of some tender, loving care. The city had a Navy Hill project that they were pursuing several years ago that would have saved this structure, but that project never materialized. Now there is a convention center hotel project that is in the works and is supposed to save it, supposedly, but we need to keep watch, and we've been focused on this building for the better part of a decade, and really would like to see it revitalized. So just this photograph down here is the plan from what I think is the one remaining bidder for this convention center hotel project, and that's the Blues Armory right there. So we do think it will have a place of prominence, but we need to see what the final details are. And similarly, this is West Hospital, and West Hospital, many of you may recall, defined the Richmond skyline for the better part of the 20th century, and it's at risk now. We believe the building can be effectively adapted for housing, which is a critical community need these days, and we think it can and should be saved. Historic rehabilitation tax credits are a really key tool in the preservationist toolbox for things like this, and they can make this plan more viable. Now, you may think of downtown Richmond as an office district, and indeed it was, and sort of still is, but there are a number of historic office buildings downtown that have been rehabbed for housing using tax credits. These include the Mutual Building, which won a Golden Hammer Award in 2024, which has a number of housing, I think it's 70 units, the First and Merchants Building, and the Virginia Power Electric Building. So these historic rehab tax credits are really important, and they encourage private investment with a we're quietly working behind the scenes to encourage a preservation solution for this. So we'll move to another case study. This is the Bird Park Pump House, which was originally known as the New Pump House. With Richmond's water supply infrastructure so much in the news today, it is timely to take a look at the Bird Park Pump House. This pump house was built in 1876, and it was a combination, like the Blues Armory, of a civic infrastructure project with a public amenity. It was designed and constructed by Colonel Cutshaw, city engineer Wilford Emery Cutshaw. He was a grand figure in the development of Richmond who oversaw the construction of roads, sidewalks, schools, armories, parks, markets, and Old City Hall. And like Old City Hall, this is a wonderfully executed Victorian Gothic Revival building built of Virginia granite. The facility pumped water uphill using hydropower from the canals to the Bird Park Reservoir, the city's main water supply, and still a key element of the city's water supply. Both the reservoir and the pump house served that infrastructure need, but they also combined well-designed public amenities. The reservoir included a promenade so that you could walk around the reservoir with your sweetheart, and the pump house included a dance floor on its upper story. Between 1883 and 1924, for about 50 years, Richmonders could board a flat-bottom boat at 7th Street and ride up a canal to the pump house and its open-air ballroom. It became a popular social venue. It was expanded in 1905, electricity was installed, but by 1924, it was superseded and closed. The equipment was sold for scrap before World War II to the Japanese. By 1950, the city planned to demolish it. Instead, in 1956, it was sold to First Presbyterian Church, and the church held it until the 1970s when it was reverted to the city. And the city opened a park surrounding the structure in the 1990s. Here you can see what the pumps look like in use and the room where they once were. In the 2000s, Historic Richmond worked with the city to identify a preservation solution. We investigated public-private partnerships. We investigated private development opportunities. We had it listed on the National Register for Historic Places, which would facilitate tax credits for any private developer, and also ensured its historic significance was recognized. But we were unable to identify a viable private development solution. And the 2008 financial crisis limited the city's bandwidth to move forward on such an effort anyway. Here you can see this is what the dance hall looks like now. This side is open to the canal and is a really unique, cool space. So what lessons did we learn from that effort 20 years ago? You might say that our effort was not successful, but think about it and flash forward to today, where we are now, and perhaps we are better off for waiting on this project. Young Richmonders just love the riverfront parks and trails. The tourist numbers for these parks and trails are mind-boggling because they're great places for people. And we believe, based on our involvement here over the past several years, that people would love to see the pump house as the centerpiece of the James River Park system and have it revitalized as a public amenity and not necessarily as a private project. We also believe that the more people understand about the science and engineering behind public infrastructure like this, the better off we will be. So today, there is a plan for an accessible and environmentally sensitive project that would revitalize the pump house. The community wants to see this building alive and in active use and as a community amenity. Over the past several years, we've been thinking a lot about how to get this done. We've worked with a volunteer group, the Friends of the Pump House, to develop a window restoration project. This is one of our former board members, Rob Comet, who also is a board member of the Friends of the Pump House, and he has led the effort to pull the boards off of the windows and open the building up to daylight again inside, and it's just been transformative. You can really now envision this building in use once you've taken these boards off. We also have obtained some funding. We have $500,000, and we use that to encourage the city to find some of their own funding to develop a larger project. The city was able to receive a Saving America's Treasures grant from the National Park Service. And so our money with the Saving America's Treasures grant funding and a little bit of funding from the city, we're in the process of planning a roof restoration project. That's part of that seal the envelope approach. We hope that that will get underway in the next year. And if it does, that roof project plus the window project will be the biggest investment in this building in a century. And after that is done, we will need to figure out how to get good access to the building. And this is the vision to add a second level walkway to remember the ramp at Old City Hall? You know, how do you get into these buildings? So anyway, that's our vision, and that's been conceptually reviewed by the Department of Historic Resources, so we think that's a good approach. So the next big question is, where do we get the funding? Well, we don't have the answer for that yet, but we're hoping that angels will appear as they did with the Masons Hall project. Stay tuned. We've talked about civic buildings so far, and I thought I'd give you a little bit of a recent neighborhood approach. Since the 1950s, Historic Richmond has had a heavy neighborhood focus, starting with Churchill, Union Hill, Churchill North. We've been involved in Jackson Ward and Monroe Ward. When I first arrived in 2015, I wanted to try to make preservation more accessible and affordable. So we started looking carefully at some other areas where the private market was less active. The private market had gotten very active in the East End neighborhoods, and prices were just going through the roof. And so it did not seem like that was a good place to focus on affordability. So we began looking at the north side streetcar suburbs. And this is a map, I don't know if you can read it, but these red lines are the streetcar lines that went through the city. And these darker colors are the earliest towns which later became streetcar suburbs as they were annexed by the city. So this is Barton Heights, which was incorporated in 1889, Brooklyn Park, Ginter Park, Sherwood Park, Highland Park, and Chestnut Hill. We're going to talk about Barton Heights here. Deep in our files, we found a 1981 survey prepared by my forebears at Historic Richmond. Using this survey, we identified several pilot blocks where we might focus our efforts, and that's down by that arrow. Our vision was for a mixed income neighborhood with a diversity of housing options. We wanted high quality historic homes that were affordable, new homes that were affordable, market rate homes, and some smaller rental opportunities. We started out with a phased approach. We developed some criteria for our involvement with the property. That's lots of words, you don't care about that. And then we ultimately found a partner. We worked with a affordable housing nonprofit here in Richmond called Project Homes, and they're wonderful people to work with, wonderful partners, and we identified 3 houses with which to start, and these are the 3 houses on the map. This is Montiero Street, but if you keep going down this way, it becomes First Street and goes into Gilpin Court. So this was the entrance into the neighborhood, and we thought that Montiero Street corridor was really important. We met with the neighbors to show them our plans. They were really excited about the home ownership opportunities after seeing these houses vacant and derelict for so long. And the 3 projects in phase 1 were completed in 2021, and all 3 homes were sold through the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust as permanently affordable housing. That's a land trust model. So here are 2 of the homes. And then the 4th home was the grandest house and was also the worst on the corridor. I don't know if you can see here, there's pretty much missing a roof and parts of the sides of the building. Project Homes acquired this site, but then realized that they did not think they could save the building. It was too big to be even remotely affordable. We had always envisioned this as a market rate project with a granny flat or accessory dwelling unit in the back to allow for the creation of generational wealth. We found our structural engineer said that it could be saved, and we have a developer partner who likes really scary, ugly houses. And he said not only could he tackle the project, he really wanted to tackle the project. So we worked out an arrangement with Project Homes to split the lot. They would build 2 new houses on the vacant parcels, and this historic home was rehabbed with the assistance of a facade grant from Historic Richmond. So when this Southern Barton Heights project is done, there'll be 4 rehabbed home ownership opportunities, 2 new homes, 1 rental, for a total of 7 housing units, 6 of which are affordable. And this one is for sale if anybody is looking for their friends or family. So we moved from that facade grant and started thinking about facade grants. As we spent more time focused on affordability, our project model evolved. And under the old model, we'd buy a structure, we'd do some work on it, and then we'd sell it. And then we'd take the proceeds from that and do another project. Then we started acquiring vacant houses and transferring them to a developer partner and providing construction financing. But these were typically long-term, low-interest loans, and there was a subsidy built into that. And so we started looking at whether we should just take that subsidy up front, and that was the approach with that last house. With historic rehabilitation tax credits, the private market really got involved with a lot of preservation projects, and so the ones that we ended up doing were so ugly that no one else in their right mind would do them. You needed a nonprofit to do them. So we started looking at, well, we want to keep houses from getting into that shape. So how do we keep them from getting into that shape? And how do we keep the neighborhood in the neighborhood and combat displacement? So we started looking at whether we should pilot a facade grant project. So we are currently working on piloting facade grants in Jackson Ward, Churchill, North, and Union Hill, which were all historically redline neighborhoods. We're targeting these at homeowner occupants. This was the one business project, and we're still working on that and trying to work out the kinks, but we think it's a really exciting thing to do, and we're getting good feedback from the community on it. So all of that is very happy projects, but we're also seeing a lot of demolitions these days. And demolitions have a significant impact, whether they're in our downtown neighborhood, downtown business district, or in our neighborhoods. And sometimes they are a result of that bad building syndrome that I mentioned earlier. Owners starve a building of resources, thinking it will magically take care of itself. Then the building either falls down on its own, which we call demolition by neglect, or the owner demolishes it, arguing that it's not worth saving. Demolitions in historic neighborhoods have a particularly damaging impact. And because the neighborhoods lose their history and culture, and they often lose viable homes for people and businesses. We've seen this from the East End to the Museum District to the West End, North and South Side. Richmond generally has no review of demolitions. And even where they do, as in this historic district on Marshall Street in Chimborazo, the penalty for violating it is de minimis. The penalty for this illegal demolition in a historic district was only $200. So how do we create the incentive framework for preservation? We're working to combat these demolitions by helping the homeowners with the repairs that we just mentioned and by lobbying for regulatory changes such as a demolition review. You can help too. When the city releases a cultural heritage plan in the next month or so, we hope you will contact City Hall and tell them that the city's historic resources are really important and they should be saved. So finally, placemaking and preservation is all about the work of many hands over many hours to conceive of pockets of our city that are welcoming, connecting, aspirational, and beautiful. Each of the places that we've discussed today connects us to our past and to other people, the people who built them, the people who used them, the people who saved them, and to future generations who want to understand who we were and who we are and who we will be. We need to remain vigilant and work hard to ensure that Richmond is unique, beautiful, and authentic going forward. That is what we do every day at Historic Richmond, and I'm so grateful to you for joining me today and listening to this talk. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Thoughts, questions?
I was the public affairs officer at Charleston Air Force Base when Joe Riley was elected. And I was on the Hanover County Planning Commission when he came to Richmond to tell how badly some of his buildings were. Like the only thing that was holding up one building was the cables coming out of the ground holding up the wall. And that was really something to hear, that he took some of those buildings that were just falling down and he saved them. But he had a long, long history. By the time he reached Richmond, his hair was white.
Well, he's definitely been, he's got a lot of fans, not just in Charleston, but all over the place. Charleston is really fortunate in that its historic districts are compact and all within one neighborhood. Richmond has more historic fabric than Charleston does, but it's been chewed away at in the middle and around the perimeter, and so we've got isolated neighborhoods as opposed to this one cohesive historic district. And I think one of the really important things that Joe Riley did was he recognized that the historic buildings were an asset for Charleston. And I think the business community there recognizes it as well. And I'm not sure that we've got all the same ingredients that he does, but he's been very successful, and he's got a lot of fans amongst the historic preservation developers in Richmond, I can tell you that.
Historic Richmond was extremely influential in saving Church Hill. We lived in Church Hill. We restored a house there. We restored 2 houses. And they stood, they were working with anybody that would do it to buy a house and restore it. And so mostly these were people who did not live in the neighborhood, had no intention of living in the neighborhood, but they were interested in saving Church Hill because of its historic significance. So just a little pat on the back there.
Well, thank you, and thank you for being one of the investors in that neighborhood. I think strong neighborhoods require really dedicated, committed residents who will go out every Saturday morning and pick up trash, and who pour their blood, sweat, and tears into the neighborhoods. And so we're very fortunate that there are a number of Church Hill residents who have lived there for 40 or more years and are very committed to it. One of the surprising things now is that if we wanted to buy one of the houses that we worked on so long ago, we couldn't even begin to afford it, because it may have taken 50 years in some cases, but the real estate market values those historic buildings now. So, yep, there's a lovely article in the February 2025 Virginia Living magazine focused on Church Hill and all the cool things to do in Church Hill. So you might check out that magazine.
We've been checking it out because we're voting for the best retirement community in Virginia.
Ah. Well, you guys sure seem to have fun in there, so I think you might win. Anyway, well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate your warm welcome.
Thank you, Cyane, for coming. We appreciate it. Have a good night, everybody.